everyone. Welcome to the PageStarter podcast. I am joined today with Jared Gulian. He is the best-selling author of the heartwarming memoir and suspenseful sci-fi. He was born and raised in the suburbs of Detroit, but left the U.S. when he was 31 to travel the world. After living in Japan for 4 years, he eventually settled down in a tiny olive farm in rural New Zealand. Rural is a tough word, where he's resided for nearly 20 years. He lives with his partner, 4 majestic horses, and a small flock of Machiavellian chickens. Both of Jared's books, a comic expat memoir called An Olive Grove at the Edge of the World and a suspenseful sci-fi thriller called The Last Beekeeper, have hit the national bestseller list in New Zealand. Welcome, Jared. So happy to have you here.
Thank you.
How
It's very good to
exciting.
be here. Thank you so much.
Yes. And we first connected on TikTok, so I highly recommend going to TikTok and following him if you are there. Always interesting to see your olive grove farm in video, and also on YouTube. There's those videos are there as well. So be sure to follow him on all social media. All right, so tell us a little bit about your publishing journey and how you ended up where you are today.
Well, it was sort of a roundabout sort of way, as things often are. You don't expect you want to accomplish something and you never expect the path that you'll take to actually get there. I was working on fiction for years. I took a writing course here in Wellington in New Zealand, taught by one of the graduates of the Iowa Workshop in Iowa, Curtis Sittenfeld, who's an amazing New York Times bestseller. And I was writing a novel at the time, and she came out. I invited her out for lunch because she hadn't been outside of Wellington. So she came out one weekend, and we went walking through the olive grove, and she said, "Jared, why don't we write about this place?" And at the time, I was writing fiction, and I was like, well, why would I do that? And she said, people would want to read about this place. So I continued with the novel I was working on, but that thought was lodged in my head. I started out doing a blog, and I was just blogging about the things we were learning, because we're living on what in New Zealand is called a lifestyle block. It's like a small holding or an acreage, a hobby farm. It's 20 acres, so it's not a massive farm, but it's big enough to be a lot of work. And my partner and I are 2 city boys, so I was just writing about what we were learning and kind of making fun of myself and what I did and didn't know, and making light fun of my neighbors as well. And it became very popular, and it won some awards and got some press in New Zealand. And then I turned it into a book, and it got published by one of the big publishers in New Zealand, and it hit the bestseller list. And so I never, it was not a journey I intended to make that direction, and there it was. So sometimes odd things happen when you just listen to the opportunities.
Yeah, that's amazing. And inspired by your surroundings. I mean, here you are on an olive grove, you're learning so many things, you're on this journey. And when was this? This was back in 2003, right?
We moved to New Zealand in 2003. I started the blog in 2009. Okay. We moved out here in about 2006. So when I started the blog, I was writing stories from our first 3 years. And what really worked for me, which it turns out it's really good writing advice, is that I had a weekly goal. And every week I published a sort of a short story. It always had a beginning, middle, and end. And it always had a hook in the beginning to keep people interested. This is in the heyday of blogging, and there were a lot of blogs, and you want to catch people's attention right away. Each story was about 1,000 to 1,500 words. And I did it every week. Every Saturday morning, I published a new story. And I pretended like I was a journalist at a newspaper, and I had a deadline. And what turned out really good is that by doing that and being regular with it, one, I learned a lot about writing by doing it, but I also saw what people were responding to. Certain posts got a lot of comments, and I had a Facebook page and was sharing it there and on Twitter. And sometimes it would be moderate interest, and other times it would just completely go off. And I started looking at, well, what is it that people are really responding to? And it was the stories that I had humor, that I made fun of myself. Those were really popular. And so by kind of writing it in public, I learned what was working well. And it was interesting because the blog readers, the subscribers to the blog grew and grew, and they kind of became accountability partners for me, because they expected that story on Saturday morning. And if I didn't publish it, I would get emails from people saying, I've got my Saturday morning coffee, and where's your story? So it was good because they were, as I say, accountability partners for me. And it really helped because it was all down to words on the page, which is the best writing advice you can ever have. Words on the page.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you were, I mean, accountability partners and also sort of beta readers, they were telling you what they liked and what they didn't like. And then what was your process from, did you cherry pick the best items to put into the book, or how did you form the story using, sort of the blog as your starting point?
What I did is after I had sort of enough content that could make a book, I slowed my production schedule of my stories and I said, okay, now I'm only publishing a new story on every full moon because the blog was called Moon Over Martinborough, and that ended up being the title of the book in New Zealand. The international edition is called An Olive Grove at the Edge of the World because nobody knows what Martinborough is. But in New Zealand, Moon Over Martinborough did really well. So I changed my schedule so that I had more time to work on cultivating the content I had instead of trying to keep that deadline every week. And then I went through and said, okay, the stories that people responded to the most were the stories that happened on the Olive Grove. I had other stories about travels we'd done around New Zealand, that sort of thing. And then I had some stories that were less humorous, that weren't as strong, and I weeded those out. So I really did take the best of the stories, the ones focused on the Olive Grove and what we were learning as city boys in rural New Zealand. And then I actually worked up, how do I make a story arc out of all of these separate stories? And what I read at the time was, there's that book by the guy who, Michael Vogler, who wrote The Writer's Journey. And he took work from Joseph Campbell, looking at the monomyth of the hero's journey and those key elements. And I realized that what happened in my life fitted into that very well in terms of, what I was experiencing, going to a new place, learning new things, and then kind of returning with, the golden kind of chalice sort of thing, which I actually ended up having a commercial olive oil that I went back into Wellington and sold. So I realized this is my story arc. It's right there in front of me. And then I built it around that, and I added and tweaked the story so that there was more of a trajectory across the whole thing.
Incredible. Incredible that your actual life fits into the hero's journey.
But that's why the hero's journey is so amazing, right? Because it resonates with us as human beings, and that's why all the Greek and Roman myths and many myths around the world actually fall into that sort of format.
Yep. Yep. And that's why we love to hear the story over and over and over again. We can't get enough of it because we want to see everything work out in the end, but there has to be that drama. There has to be the hero loses everything. We have to have all of that, all those elements in place.
There's always allies and people that help you along the way, and those were my neighbors. There were critical points in the journey where one year our olive harvest just went bust, and we thought something was wrong with the olive grove. I mean, all the elements were there, so it really amazed me when I looked at that. And I didn't plan that; it just was there in front of me.
Yeah. Incredible. Incredible. And if you hadn't had, that writing mentor come in and say, hey, you should write about this place, it might not even have occurred to you.
It never would have, because when she first suggested it, I was like, well, why would I do that? And what she talked about, which was so good that I'll never forget, is she talked about there are all these things we want to write about. And then there are all these things that people want to read about. And as writers, we should write to the place where those two things overlap, like in a Venn diagram. And that place where you might want to write about this thing over there, but there's not much of an interest in that. You could still do that if it's important to you. Or if you say, okay, but this here I'm also interested in, and I know there's a bunch of people who want to read that, that's the sweet spot.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I'm a firm believer in, like writing what you want, but then selling what people want to read. So it's like, you can write whatever you want. No one's saying you can't write, your fun travel stories that some people aren't interested in, but then, that's not going to make a good book to sell. Or if you do publish it, just publish it for the love of it and for, creating something and taking something start to finish. But if you want to market the book and make book sales and reach readers, you have to create something that people are demanding to read. So
absolutely. And because I went through that process, when the book came out in New Zealand, it hit the national bestseller list. It was on the bestseller list for 6 weeks. It went up to number 4. And it kind of made sense because I had actually tested the content earlier.
Right.
So I knew what was popular, and that's what I put in the book, and that's why it hit the bestseller list.
Yeah. Yeah. So how is it being a little local celebrity in New Zealand?
It's funny, and the worst thing was when that book came out, and so that the initial edition of that book came out in New Zealand in 2013, and the publisher insisted that my picture be on the cover. So, when it first came out, it had a lot of coverage, a lot of press. It's was on Radio New Zealand. They excerpted some things from it. It was all over the place, TV, whatever. And every time I went into a bookstore, there was like a face out of my book with my face on it. And I'm a total introvert. So I was like, oh, I kind of tried to stay away from bookstores because I felt so conspicuous. And I had people stop me on the street and say, hey, you're that Olive Grove guy. And it was really disconcerting because, I'm, as I say, an introvert. I'm a very private person. And so when I did the international edition, which I self-published, my face is not on the cover.
Let's remove that. But still, it's a beautiful cover. It's still a beautiful cover. So it's definitely one that, either way, when you have control over the cover, you can make it what you want, but it's good. Although, I will say when you meet people who've read your book, isn't it also really satisfying in a way to put faces behind the numbers? Like especially because you are a bestseller, those numbers can feel strange, right? Like it just becomes numbers. It's like, oh, 10,000, 15,000. Like it just becomes numbers. But then when you actually meet someone, you meet a face and a name and a personality behind that number. And you're like, oh my gosh, this person took time out of their life to read my words. How is that for you as an author?
If I'm ready for it, when people sort of come up to you out of nowhere and like, oh, I read your book, it takes me a moment to be like, okay, like I can be fully present with this person right now because I am so introverted. But once I can move into that, all right, here I am, I'm talking to this person who knows a lot more about me than I know about them. But they're really passionate about what I've written. And that's amazing. That's an incredible gift. And one thing I love more than anything is that the book has recipes interspersed because while we were learning how to take care of the olive grove, we were also learning how to cook because my partner and I had always relied on takeaways. So we were learning a lot about cooking. And I'd been diagnosed with celiac disease just before we moved out here. So I was learning how to cook gluten-free. So it was a steep learning curve. One of the recipes is a recipe from a dear friend who has since passed away. It's a carrot cake recipe. It's, in my opinion, the best carrot cake recipe in the world. And when I get people telling me, oh, I made Dave's carrot cake for my mother's 80th birthday and she loved it. And that, it really hits me. Because this is a dear, dear friend who's passed away, and he would be so pleased. And so those personal connections between people are just really magical.
Yeah. Yeah. And it lives on, even though your friend passed on, his legacy is in the book and continuing to reach people and to affect lives. What a gift.
Yes, it really is. Literally just yesterday or the day before, someone on Instagram tagged me because they'd made cupcakes with Dave's carrot cake. And I was like, oh, yes, And so I send it to friends who knew Dave, and everyone's always, it's really nice to see that.
Nice. I'll have to try it. I love carrot cake. I'll have to try it.
A lot of sugar, but it's good.
It's okay. That's okay. You have to give and take. Like if you're going to have carrots in there, you got to add the sugar. That's good. So, now that you're on, TikTok and YouTube which are video mediums, obviously you were big in the blogging heyday. I'm not saying blogs are dead, but I'm just saying that
it's not like
attention has shifted to short form video, yes. Even long form video, but mostly short form video. So, but generally the same idea is kind of the same. I mean, it's not writing, but if you approach your videos like a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, you can kind of do the same thing. What would you recommend for an author? Would you recommend the blogging route, or would you recommend transforming stories into video form?
I think that it's a bit of a cop-out, but I think it depends. I think for me, the blogging was incredibly valuable because of the writing that it took. And, there's that kind of rule, the 10,000 hour rule, that you have to do something for 10,000 hours before you become an expert. And for me, blogging really helped me do that because I crafted every week, a story with a hook, rising action, conflict, resolution. And I did that every week. every week. And so I learned a lot about how to do that. And it's helped me in other writing as well. So, and that actual writing was incredibly valuable to me. Blogs now are not as popular as they were when I was doing my blog in 2009. So I think if someone were to do that now, they'd need to have different expectations. It may or may not take off because blogs just really aren't as popular, and people are on video. But I think even those lessons, as you say, you can apply them all to video, because especially in TikTok, where someone's attention will go so quickly, if you don't have a very strong hook in the beginning of your video. And I mean, I see it on my own videos. When I don't have a strong hook, they just don't get as much views. It's pretty straightforward. So I think that you just need to have appropriate expectations for your medium. Like, it depends on what are you trying to get out of it. If you want writing practice, blogging is great. And doing it in public kind of forces you to put it out there, because one things new writers can fall into is kind of trying to hide our work. So it's a really good habit for that. But I think if you want more eyeballs on what you're doing, then I think short form video and TikTok is an incredibly good thing to do now.
Yeah. Yeah. And even what you could do is, and what I would recommend is, definitely blog for that writing practice, because it is so key. And also learning what resonates with the audience, no matter how small you may have. It's a good sample size to indicate, okay, this one did really well, this one didn't do as well. And then you still get that feedback. And Absolutely. Then even, taking your most popular content and turning that into video if you have an inspirational quote or someone excerpting your own work into video and putting that with a beautiful background and inspirational music or whatever it is, and turning that. So always, leveraging both as much as possible. But I totally agree. And I grew up in the blogging, and that's how I learned how to write as well. And I mean, I agree. You learn what resonates with people, you learn how to craft it. And even writing a blog could take 4 or 5 days of writing and revising. And so it is a really good way to practice your craft and to really hone your craft to write for Absolutely. Readers, which is so valuable. So
I think one thing people could do now is, if they were blogging and they wanted to use short form video as well, they could always use a short video as a teaser into your blog. That's always a possibility. I don't know how effective that would be, but it's always the kind of thing you just experiment, try it, see what works, and do more of what works and less of what doesn't.
That'd be so great. Maybe you could try that. I mean, are you still marketing your 2 books? I know you talk about it, and you, reply to book reviews and duet those. But is that anything that you would do, is sort of go back to that sort of teaser method and insert links into your blog and drive people to read your blog?
I have at various times debated writing another sort of memoir type of book, and could take a million different forms, and I've thought about different forms. I really get a lot, personally, I get a lot out of writing about life, because writing is often how I figure out life and reflect on what's happened to me and make sense of it. And I'm fortunate enough that I've written about my life in a way that people seem to be interested. So I've gone back and forth. Some days I'm like, I'll never write another memoir. Other days I'm like, maybe. So never say never. I get emails all the time, people asking me to write a follow-up to Olive Grove at the Edge of the World, all the time.
Well, if they're demanding it, if they're hungry for it,
they are.
You have a built-in audience. Yep. They're asking for more. It's up to you to deliver. It's up to you to decide if you want to deliver. But it sounds like the market is there, ready for it. And I love what you said about, writing is how I figure out my life. I think so many, when I speak with authors, they're like, I don't know enough, I can't write about it. Or I haven't been through the thing yet, so I can't write about it. It's like, that's exactly what you should be doing. Like, you should absolutely be writing about it, because do we ever have it all figured out? Or is there ever a point? And if we keep waiting for that magical moment where we've figured out life, like, it's going to be too late to write about it.
Absolutely. And for me, in writing about our journey here on the Olive Grove and learning how to take care of the trees and the animals, I was figuring it out. And if I'd waited till I knew everything to write about it, it would have been really boring. Mm-hmm. So it was writing about the learning that was actually what was compelling for people.
Yeah. If you're an expert, no one wants to hear an academic textbook on how to care for
Exactly.
an olive grove. We want to go
That's
through
a
the
very
trials and tribulations and the emotions and the ups and the downs and we've lost
that's a
all of
very
it. It's great. It's great. Okay, so you talk a lot about connectedness with others, and this is in your work. Obviously, it's in your memoir, and but you've even woven it into the suspense of The Last Beekeeper. Tell me a little bit about this theme, and do you interweave this theme of connectedness because you think we're losing connectedness in our lives and you want to see more of it, or because you have this insight into connectedness that maybe others don't. Tell me more about that.
I think similar to with other things, I write what I'm trying to figure out, and connectedness is really important to me. Connections with other people, with the local community, or community, whether that's a virtual book talk community or my neighbors and people here in this rural area. There are a lot of similarities between virtual online communities and local communities in terms of the way people are drawn together by common interests and support each other, and the way we need each other, and the way we have success through help from other people. That all those things I just said is true of authors on Book Talk as it is living in rural New Zealand. And there's this great Maori proverb. Maori are the indigenous people of New Zealand, and there's a great proverb that says, "What is the most important thing in the world? He tangata, he tangata, he tangata." It is the people, the people, the people. And that's everything. It's the people, it's really what matters. And kind of looping back to what you were saying earlier about meeting readers and seeing how your writing touches them. Those sorts of connections are, for me, they're one of the things, one of the very few things that gives life real meaning. For me, it's also a connection with nature and animals. That's another thing that gives me a real sense of meaning in my life. But the main character in The Last Beekeeper, which, as you say, yes, it's a sci-fi thriller, but the main character has moved to a remote island in Lake Michigan and is connected to local people within that local community. And his connections with those people really mirrors my experience living in rural New Zealand. And that's no coincidence. It's because it's one of those things that, it's like those things you think about and try and figure out and get to an understanding why is this so satisfying? And why have so many of us lost this? I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, and while we had block parties and we had nice neighbors, there wasn't the same sense of community that I have here in rural New Zealand. And that's partly, I think, because you do really need your neighbors in an area like this. It's time to harvest. You need neighbors to come over and help you. Your car breaks down. You need someone to give you a lift into the village. And especially, I think, in suburban America, things are set up so that you don't need each other and everybody's self-contained. And I think that's one reason why we lose a sense of community. But that sense of community is so critical. And so I probably, in one way or another, will write about that as a theme coming up in my writing for the rest of my life, I imagine, because it's so important to me.
Yeah, I love that. I think, we live in a small town in Sweden. I would say it's a lot larger than your small town in New Zealand. We have about 40,000 people in our small town, but just outside of the capital city. And I would say that I was as an American living in another country, again, like we see community differently. And when you're in a new culture, you're experiencing their definition of community, and it's quite the culture shock as well. So do you think that has also, I mean, yes, it's a small town, but also it's a completely different culture, and the rural part, I'm sure, factors in a lot of it compared to
Yes,
the city living.
absolutely. It's rural. It's a different country. But oddly, before my partner and I moved here, we were living in Japan. So when we moved here, in Japan, having grown up in the States, Japan is a culture completely different from the culture that we were raised in, culturally, language. And so when we moved from Japan to New Zealand, it was interesting because it felt more familiar. It was like, oh, okay, this is, more, it's, currently predominantly English speaking. It is a bicultural nation with, Maori speakers as well. And that aspect was new, and to learn about Maori culture and what that means within the history of New Zealand was new to me. And I would get these kind of false feelings of like, oh, okay, I understand the rules here. And then I'd be reminded, oh, no, something weird would happen. And I'd be like, oh, wait a minute, I wasn't expecting that. So it was a bit confusing coming from a place that was so different, such as Japan, where I knew all the time I didn't know the rules, and it took me a while to figure that out.
So you're in this false sense of security, like, okay, I'm comfortable. I got this figured out. And it's like,
Yeah.
nope, no, you're stepping
Yep.
on toes over here. Stay in your
Yep.
lane.
Yep.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Really great. So tell me about, because you are narrating your audiobook for An Olive Grove at the Edge of the World. Tell me about that process and how that's going.
Well, that was a huge endeavor, and something I resisted for a long time, because I thought, well, what I bring to the table is writing. So I'll write and I'll get someone else to narrate it. And I've had emails and messages from people for years saying, you need to narrate the audiobook because it's a memoir. And I was really reluctant. And I went so far as to audition some narrators who were all very good, but every single one of them, for some reason or another, I was like, oh no, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. They're not, they're making my neighbors sound too much like idiots, or they're, but there was always something that, because it's a very precious story to me, right? The people in these stories are important to me, and I cherish them, and I want it to be done with the right spirit. So I finally relented, and I said, okay, I'll do it myself. So I'd planned to do it myself for a long time. And then oddly, what happened was almost a year ago now, I broke my back. And so that really took me out of action. It's a long recovery. I'm still recovering from that. But it was probably 6 months after I broke my back, doing physio continually, all that sort of stuff, that I started to feel, okay, I can work in short bursts. And so I did a bunch of reading to figure out, all right, I've never been an audiobook narrator. How do I do this? I set up one of the spare bedrooms with mattresses leaned up against the walls and pillows in the corner for sound dampening, which I read in a Reddit thread you could do to do it on the cheap. And I also, on TikTok, I followed quite a few audiobook narrators. Some of them used their lives to do narration live, incredibly informative. And I read a bunch of books and figured it out. And so I recorded it in small bursts when I was feeling well enough. It took me, in the end, it was probably a 9 months worth of, not sustained effort, but, from beginning to end, it was 9 months. Wow. And I'm really proud of the result. And I feel like, okay, everyone who told me I should narrate it was absolutely right. And now I hired, through Upwork, I hired an audio engineer to help me with the audio editing, and I'm publishing it through Findaway. And so it will be available wide on Audible, as well as every other place that sells audiobooks, well, most of the places. And it's launching on the 2nd of June, and I'm really excited about it, because it was also really a great healing kind of journey for me to go over those stories again and to read each chapter, and be reminded of how, even though I had broken my back, I was going through this process of being reminded how fortunate I am and all these amazing people in my life. So it's a real passion project for me, and I'm really, really pleased with the result. And I can't wait till people can hear it on the 2nd of June.
Yes, that's great. I do think, since it is a memoir, yes, you have to do it in your own voice. It would be weird anyone else reading your story. Even, with fiction, it's a little different. Like, okay, like other people can read this, it's no problem. But coming from you and your experiences, I think doing it yourself is a good way forward. Yes. And I will link to that so that everyone can visit your Amazon site, or maybe your website. Maybe you can direct people wherever they want to go there. That's very exciting. Very exciting.
When the audiobook's out, I'll put all the links up on my website.
Yes. That's so great. So, and that's such great advice in terms of if someone is looking to narrate their own audiobook, is to, do your research and then learn from professional narrators, and then of course hire people to finish and make the the end product completely professional and balanced and all of that stuff that it needs to be, that, you don't need to figure out all the technical things. I think that's really important for authors doing any of this self-publishing process is, do the parts that you learn enough to know what you need to do. But if you don't have the technical skills, if you don't you don't have to have all the answers and you don't have to have all of the expertise. You just need to then have the wherewithal to hire someone to fill in those pieces. What other advice would you give authors who are wanting to self-publish? You've been through the traditional publishing process, you've been through the indie publishing process, and now the audiobook. So what are some of the key things that you would advise?
Well, it's been an odd thing for me because since I did start out traditional, and then I went self-published when I couldn't get an overseas publisher to publish my memoir. I got rejected by like 33 different publishers, and so I said, well, I'll do it myself. And so then I learned how to do that. But then, having done that, the publishers, it was US-based publishers, said they thought it was too niche. But then when I self-published it, the book hit #1 in 3 different categories on Amazon.com, 2 categories in Canada, and 1 category in Australia. So it is, it's tried and tested content. I know that it's popular, and I knew it would work, and it did. And I learned a lot in doing it because I was not going to be told no. I was like, no, I'm doing this. I know it's good. So I backed myself. So I think that's the first lesson: back yourself. Really back yourself and believe in yourself, and don't be afraid to put yourself out there. That's really important. When I decided to write my sci-fi thriller, I didn't even submit it to traditional publishers. I said, no, you know what? Actually, I love, and because I come from a blogging background of connections, again, connections directly with readers, I was getting messages and emails and comments. I love the kind of direct connection with readers and the hands-on experience of making the thing. So I decided to go, I hired a developmental editor, I hired proofreaders, all those things that you would do in a traditional process. So that's the second thing, is make sure that you hire good editors. That's incredibly important. And hire for the skill set that you don't have. If you can do developmental editing on your own work, then that's great. Hire a copy editor or a proofreader. And if you need all of them, I hired a developmental editor, line editor, and a proofreader. So the product came out really good. And I was also able to learn from the process I went through with traditional publishers. So I think those are some of the key things I've learned. Back yourself, hire the skills that you don't have, and don't be afraid to put it out there, because especially with things like TikTok and other social media, you can get eyeballs on your content. It's not impossible.
Yeah. This is really a unique time for indie published authors, I think, because we can have these direct conversations with readers so easily. And we have social media platforms that are putting your content out to people regardless of how many followers you have. Like TikTok does not rely on a high follower count. So even someone starting out new, it's not too late to get started. So it's kind of, and it's never too late. There will be another social media platform that does the same thing. So it's like it's never too late. You just have to put it out there, believe in yourself, and produce a high quality product. I mean, we can't underestimate the value of a well-written, well-edited, beautiful cover. I mean, all of that is going to do better than anything less than that. So the content is,
in putting out that high quality content is so critical. And as a result of that process, one of the odd things that happened for me is when I put out my sci-fi thriller, then it was maybe 6 months or so afterwards that the book was selected in New Zealand for a really big event in this region called One Book, One Community, where the coordinated libraries choose a book to have everybody read, and they have book talks about it, and they have tours and all sorts of related things, quiz nights, all sorts of things. And they chose my book, and then my book, which I'd entirely self-published and hired my editors, hit the bestseller list in New Zealand. And that week that it hit the list, they were all traditionally published books except for mine. And it made it on the list. And, I know, okay, New Zealand's small, but it's still the bestseller list. And I'm still up against all the traditional publishers. And it was on there. And it was so validating because I had put a lot of work in to produce a quality book. And so that was the result.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. I mean, I don't want anyone to discount success in a small pond. I mean, it's still hard. It doesn't matter. And no matter how small the pond is, there are still traditionally published authors in that pond with you. You're still
Yep.
going up against the quote unquote, the gatekeepers.
Yes.
Um, so for any book to edge that out means that yes, like your marketing is on point. I also think indie published authors are way better at marketing than traditional published authors. And yes, the traditionally published, they have the distribution, they have footholds in physical markets, but the online market can really be dominated by self-published authors if you know how to market your books and get it in front of people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you raised an earlier point also that I'd like to quickly jump back to, and that was that you know, yes, things are changing, but don't be afraid to do it and do it now. It makes me think of, there's that saying about the best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago. The second best time is today.
Yep.
It's the same thing. Like, if you're going to go through the self-publishing route and putting your work out there, the best time, yep, do it 10 years ago. And if you didn't, do it today.
Yeah. Yeah. It's never too late. And the landscape is always changing and there will always be new opportunities. And so for anyone to feel disheartened or like, oh, I missed the boat, or oh, I missed, TikTok's already 4 years old or 5 years old. Like, it doesn't matter.
No,
You're only losing when you don't enter the game. That's the only way that you do miss out on things, is if you never try. So it's always worth it. It's always worth it. Okay. I had a question about, because on your TikTok, you talked about like a famous first line in one of the novels. And I'm curious because you know how important first lines are. And you talked earlier about hooks. Do you have any favorite first lines that you can share?
There's two first lines that I love so much that they're sort of etched in my brain, and from very different books. One is, of course, Pride and Prejudice, which is a very famous first line, the bit about, it is a truth universally acknowledged that any man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife. That's perfect for that book. It's such a good hook, and it's got that kind of cutting kind of humor to it, which is so good. Another book which has a really great first line is a book. It's a New Zealand book, came out in 1963, called The Scarecrow, and it's a kind of small town horror book. And the first line is, the same night our fowls were stolen, Daphne Moran had her throat cut. And it's just like, whoa.
Chilling.
It's a great jump into that way. It ends on the throat cut, and you're like, whoa, tell me more. It's a great first line.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So your first lines in the novels. So when you were creating, how much time did you spend on your first line? Was it like the hardest line to come up with, or did you just ease back on it? You're like, okay, it might not be engrave worthy, but it's there. It's good. It's good.
That's a very good question. And, off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you what the first line of either of my novels is, which is, shameful. The first chapter of An Olive Grove at the Edge, the first chapter of both books have a very strong hook. The first chapter of An Olive Grove at the Edge of the World has a chapter where I'm dealing with a sick sheep, and it's very humorous, and the city boy out in the middle of the paddock trying to prop up a sick sheep. And so it ends with kind of like, how did he get there doing this crazy thing? And then the first chapter of my sci-fi thriller ends, or it's somebody walking through the woods at twilight, and something is coming after him and he can't see it, and there's these strange noises, and then it tackles him, and it's the last line of that chapter is something like, it's crushing him so hard he couldn't even get enough air to scream.
Love it.
And so that's a hook as well. So yes. I think I've moved into more kind of first chapter hooks than first lines.
I love it. But that's an R.L. Stine trick. And I don't know if you grew up on Goosebumps. I know I did. But the R.L. Stine, I took his masterclass on masterclass.com, and he said, absolutely end every single chapter with a cliffhanger. That's how you keep them turning the pages. And looking back on it, like, yeah, of course, like it's formulaic, it's gimmicky, but it kept me as a kid turning pages constantly. I just devoured those books. So I have The Last Beekeeper. I have the prologue. So I'm assuming this is the first line that readers come into. Emmett Jones didn't know where the noise was coming from or exactly where it was, but he'd never heard anything like it before in the End Woods.
That was pretty good.
That's good. That gives people a sense of what it is. And then the first chapter, or first line of chapter one. So now Jim Parker lay alone in his large double bed, barely awake, the phone pressed to his ear, struggling to make sense of the horrible news. Very good. I think those are pretty strong first lines there. You got it.
Well, and it's funny you say although I didn't grow up on Goosebumps, that cliffhanger at the end of a chapter is such good advice. And there's times that I'm writing that I have an idea of where the chapter is going to end, and I will often get to a point where there's this major cliffhanger, and I'm like, oh, that's the end of this chapter, and then I just end the chapter and go to the next one.
Nice. Yeah. So it's like, if you don't create the cliffhanger, realize when you're on one, end of the chapter, and then you can start on the next one. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. Awesome. Is there anything else you want to share, Jared, before we wrap up?
I guess the only thing coming back to kind of connections is that, there's a lot of, I'm really active on TikTok and Book Talk, as I know you are, and there's so much happening there. I do encourage people to go check it out if you're not there. There are problems where authors fail to recognize that the people reading their books are people, and our beta readers are people. People giving us feedback are people. They're putting in labor to help us, and it is a kind of community. And just like I wouldn't be terrible to my neighbors because they support me, I support them. I value them, I cherish them. That I think those sorts of connections in an online space are just as critical. And sometimes we forget that because we're not sort of in the same room or in the same city. But it's just as important, those connections between people online. That's just as important as connections in the real world.
Agreed. There is a whole, era of internet relationships that we have built where people online actually forget that there's a human being at the other end of that account, and that the comments you leave. There's a really great, I don't know if you listen, there's an NPR podcast called The Hidden Brain, and it's written and narrated by a psychologist, and he interviews all these famous psychologists and basically talks about this years ago about like sort of this online rage farming that people do, and how satisfying it can feel to yell at someone or leave a nasty comment or something because we don't have any real world consequences. Like, you would never say that to your neighbor. You would have to be polite because they could punch you in the face if you said something like that. But that it's in our primitive brains, in our lizard brains, we still have this excitement that triggers and feels really good when we do something, because it's almost like we're protecting ourselves or protecting our community or something. So it triggers that same response in our brains, and that's why it feels so good. But online, our online capabilities have far exceeded our evolution as human beings, as hardwired human beings. And so we're getting all of this, and that's why social media is also addictive. And I love TikTok, but it is extremely addictive. So it's like, go check it out, but like take a break, set screen time limits, set a 10-minute reminder, you can set screen limits in the app itself so that it pops up. I have one. It says you've been on for 10 minutes. Like, you might want to take a break. So it is. And so it's like, you have to, almost be a step ahead and parent yourself in these situations and in online communities. And again, remind yourself, yes, these are real people, and it's not just a faceless account. And also on the flip side, we may assume we know somebody better than we do because we see into their lives and we hear them talking. And so it also creates a really interesting parasocial relationships, as well as like, oh no, I really know that person. And they're like, I don't know who you are at all.
The other aspect of it is when you get hate, which you inevitably, you get. I've had stuff come at me for I do a review of gender queer on TikTok, and that post has hate comments come through all the time because current transphobia and whatnot. You have to also be able to kind of just let that go and not let that under your skin, because someone I love dearly always used to say, hurting people hurt people. Mm-hmm. So that person who's leaving that nasty comment, like, what is the pain they're going through? And that's more a reflection of their pain. And then, so don't take it on board. Don't take it personally. That's the other really important part of managing an online presence.
Absolutely. And block,
Not even.
delete and block.
Oh,
Like
I
I'm
love block.
I'm a big fan of that, especially, some people are like, oh, everyone deserves their right to leave a comment. No, they don't. It's your space. It's
No.
your online space. You do not need to see that notification. If that really bothers you, if that comment bothers you, you can just delete it. There was a great short video on TikTok, and it was like, why would I waste my precious time arguing with you when I can just delete you from my entire existence? Like, I don't
Yeah.
need to argue with you on this. I don't need to prove I'm right. I'm just going to delete and block and eliminate you from my life. So that is something we can do in the online space as well, as we can just delete and block people. Whereas again, in person, maybe not so much. But yes, I think anytime you put yourself out there creatively, you are going to get feedback. You're going to get comments. You're going to get comments from people who don't get it. If you do go viral, it's can be quite damaging to your mental health, and because it's reaching people who don't know you and don't care about you and don't have this relationship with you. So I almost encourage people not to try to go viral. Like that shouldn't be the main goal. The main goal should be to reach your readers and engage and have fun. It shouldn't be to go viral. So well, thank you so
Absolutely.
much, Jared. This was really wonderful. And I will be sure to link to all the places where people can connect with you and buy your books and your audiobook coming out on June 2nd. How exciting!
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really nice talking.
Thanks. Thanks so much.